Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I'm delighted to be joined by Jorge Marti. He's the Secretariat of HENSA Venezuela. Welcome to our show, Jorge.
It's a pleasure to be with you, as always.
Now, 2023 has been known for many crises. We have a global crisis we are now calling the global boiling, no longer a climate change issue. You know, we are at a crisis point. Perhaps we could begin there. How has the climate change affected not only workers, but life in general? As workers, we face many struggles, from trying to keep our countries responsive to peace, trying to keep our society, coexisting, not just with each other, but with nature.
Yes, I mean, this question of the climate change crisis, which is now worsened, obviously, is one of the main issues right now, because, in fact, what you can see is capitalism is threatening the very possibility of the existence of human life on this planet, or all life, I will say. And now, I mean, right now is this heat wave in a number of countries, a number of regions in the world. But when it's not the heat wave, it's something else. Extreme weather events are increasing, obviously. And I think there's no doubt now, really, that what's triggered this question of climate change is the human action. But it's not, as they say, the responsibility of each individual to change the consumption patterns or the behavior. That is obviously important, and most people are quite prepared to make changes in their everyday life. But in reality, most studies show that most of the pollution that is causing climate change is really caused by a small minority of big multinational companies, which make multi-billion dollar profits, and they still are not prepared to change anything, not even if what's at stake is saving life on the planet. So I will say that question. Obviously, climate change affects disproportionately working class people and people in poor countries, or rather countries that are poor because of capitalist and imperialist expoliation, that are at the forefront of the suffering caused by the change in climate patterns and so on. But those who are responsible, big capitalist corporations, they're not doing anything at all to change this. In fact, I will say that we live in an extreme contradiction. We have the necessary scientific and technological means to at least start seriously to address this question, but this is not being done in any serious way because of the private profit motive. Capitalism, the existence of capitalism, is becoming increasingly in direct contradiction with, as I said, the existence of human life on the planet.
Not only that, but as Biden, decrees a climate crisis in North America, we see them ramping up a war. And when you think about war, it's the equivalent of millions of trees being clear-cut, and we already know the consequences of that. So perhaps we need to talk about this ongoing war machine of capitalism, and we can pinpoint that lens to Ukraine. This war that has been now almost 2 years in its catastrophic impact on people, but also in the level of demoralizing that has created, where as workers we are trying to create links with people. It seems we are getting farther and farther away from having alliances with each other.
Yes, I would say this war is a major feature now of world relations. And as you say, this war is being used to ramp up weapons production. 100 years ago, when the First World War, Lenin was asked, if war is a terrible thing. And he said, yes, war is terribly profitable for a small minority. The arms manufacturers are rubbing their hands every time there is a war. And now particularly they're rubbing their hands with this war in Ukraine, a massive multi-billion dollar investment in new weapons, more ammunition and so on, which is being pumped into this war so that people can continue to kill each other for the benefit of big powers that are far, far away from Ukraine. This is my opinion. This is an inter-imperialist war. It's a war between Russia and the United States, which is being conducted on the territory of Ukraine, and Ukraine is the one that's mainly supplying young men and women to die at the altar of this war, and so are young people from Russia as well. And it's a war that's completely senseless. The only reason for this war is the conflict between U.S. imperialism and Russia, which is also a powerful imperialist power, perhaps not as powerful as the United States. There's quite a degree of difference, but it's also what's Russia's interests in Ukraine are also imperialist interests. And yes, we are being asked to pay for the price of this crisis. Energy prices are going up, price of food is going up. This is not caused directly by the war, but it's a situation that's aggravated by the war. The high prices of fertilizers, high price of grain, high price of energy sources, which is aggravated by the war. And recently, the German government has approved a new budget, and the new budget includes 30 billion euro worth of cuts, which is, approximately $40 billion worth of cuts. All departments, healthcare, education, care for the elderly, pensions, everything is being cut, with the one exception of the defense budget, which is being massively ramped up. Obviously, the Rheinmetall, which is the main manufacturer of weapons in Germany, they're all very happy, but working class people are paying the price, when in reality, working class people from the US, working class people from Russia, working class people from Ukraine are basically brothers and sisters. They have nothing against each other, but they are being pushed against each other in this murderous, bloody war, which has been going on for many months now, in the interests of big business and capitalism, in the interest of the struggle between different powers for the appropriation of spheres of influence and sources of raw material, fields of investment, and so on, for destructive purposes.
Despite the signals that our governments are irresponsive and are acting in a way that benefits very few and ignore the needs of the majority, I think what we also see is that workers continue to struggle. We see it in the worker struggles in France, protecting their pensions. Perhaps since we're talking about budgets being cut and budgets being reduced to be at the service of war, can we talk about our own struggles? How do we sustain our continued resistance to imperialism and capitalism and create a way forward in the midst of all this crisis?
Yes, the one struggle that you mentioned, the French struggle against the pensions reform, was really an amazing, courageous and struggle that we should draw example from. They basically went on a massive wave of strikes and demonstrations for 3 or 4 months, from February until the beginning of June, against this one measure of the very unpopular Macron government that wanted to increase retirement age by 2 years, from 65 to 67. But this was just the trigger for this movement. It was generally a movement against right-wing policies, against the lowering of wages as caused by inflation. The young people also became involved. And I think a turning point in this struggle was the point at which, and this is very significant, the point at which Macron wasn't sure that he could get a majority in parliament for this measure. And so he used decree powers under the Article 49.3 from the French Constitution to pass this very unpopular reform without any parliamentary consultation. So that is completely scandalous. During this strike, Macron was saying the small handful of petrochemical workers are holding the country to ransom. That, on the one hand, shows the power of the working class. A small number of petrochemical workers can paralyze the country. That shows the working class can change things. But at the same time, the ones who are holding the country to ransom is a small handful of capitalist parasites. And the government is acting in the interest, even when 90% of the population is against. And they can't even get a vote through their own parliament. This is completely scandalous. And this is what brought many young people out on the streets during this French movement. Now the movement has ended, and it did not end in a victory. And I think that there was many problems with the strategy of the trade union leaders. In fact, inside the CGT, the main trade union in France, there was an opposition called Unity CGT, which won one of the votes at the CGT Congress. And they were advocating that instead of having isolated days of action every 2 weeks or every week or every 10 days, that they should have an escalation towards an all-out strike, a bit like what happened in 1968. And I think that they were right. But anyway, their strategy in the end didn't come through. They didn't have enough strength within the movement. The bureaucracy prevented them from carrying these actions forward, and the movement was defeated. But this is not the end of the story. Just a month later, we saw a massive explosion of the youth, particularly the migrant youth, the Arab communities in France against police violence and police brutality after the killing of a young French-Algerian person in France. A massive movement. It's like the George Floyd movement of France. So the struggle never ends. The question that we need to ask ourselves is what's the best strategy for winning? What is required? Is the workers, youth, they are prepared. The oppressed in general, they are prepared to struggle. What is perhaps missing is a leadership that has a clear strategy how to win. I mean, you are based in British Columbia, and we just seen this big strike of the dockers, and twice the longshore, the dock workers have voted against an agreement that was recommended by the leadership of the union. So I will say the workers are prepared to struggle. They are prepared to strike. They are prepared to make sacrifices. The workers, the poor, the peasants, the youth, the women, all the oppressed sections of society, whenever they are offered a way forward, they are prepared to struggle and make sacrifices. What's perhaps most of the times missing is a clear leadership that can lead such a movement to victory. The struggle is always there, because what drives the struggle is the crisis of capitalism, forces people. People can no longer live in the old way. And at certain occasions, there are explosions of struggle, explosions of anger. Here in Britain, we're also living through a wave of strikes. In the last 1 year, there's been big strikes in the health sector, in transport, railways, also amongst the teachers, primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, university lecturers. A whole number of strikes. The latest one is a threatened strike of the Gatwick workers, the ground handling workers. They threatened to go on strike in the middle of the holiday season, and they won. They won wage increases between 13 and 18%, well above inflation. So that shows that the struggle pays and the struggle is useful. But many times, as I said before, what is missing is a proper leadership that can lead those struggles to victory.
And even without a leader, sometimes we can see that the masses continue to mobilize and organize. And, in some ways, I think often the people lead and the leaders follow. It seems to be that case for many of our movements in Latin America. Despite all the aggression against Mexico, wanting to join BRICS and all the threats that they would be invaded and occupy, we've seen those, different alliances being mobilized. So I feel that in so many ways, we are facing this level of violence from capitalism because it is on its last days. It is a system that needs to end, and something new must be put in place in order to not only safeguard life, but also to allow us to continue to live. Because the question now is, will we be able to live on this planet, if we continue as we are? So I wonder if we could talk about the meetings that have been taken in Africa, and how there is also the energy of creating coalitions away from imperialism and imperialistic bipolar powers.
Yes, that is true. I mean, even more recently, there has been this coup in Niger, and there's been coups and overthrows of governments in a whole number of countries in that area, the belt that goes from Guinea all the way to East Africa, in a whole number of countries in the last 1 year or 2 years. And one key element of this is a rejection of French imperialism. France is one of the former colonial powers in Africa and still maintains a colonial or semi-colonial imperialist intervention in many of these countries through military bases, through multinational companies, exfoliating natural resources and so on. We say sometimes these are poor countries, but in reality they are not poor. They're very wealthy in natural resources, in minerals and so on. The people are poor because these resources are in the hands of the few multinationals. And in Niger, this is quite clear. One of the French imperialism has said, we do not accept this military overthrow. The regional alliance of countries that is under the domination of U.S. and French imperialism have said, we're going to intervene militarily in this country. And what's the reason? Because Niger is a strategic country. It's a country that controls the routes for migration into Europe from sub-Saharan Africa. Is a country that is also on the doorstep of the Sahel, where there's Islamic terrorism going on. But above all, is a country that produces a large amount of the uranium that is mined anywhere in the world. And France depends heavily on nuclear power for their energy consumption. And for nuclear power, they need uranium. And so that is the basis for this. There's been a movement away, or movement against the influence of French imperialism. But I will say that the problem is here that in some of these cases where pro-French imperialist governments have been overthrown, sometimes this has just been replaced by pro-Russian governments. And Russia wants exactly the same thing that France wants: access to raw materials, spheres of influence. So this is not an improvement. And I think that we need to go back to genuine revolutionary ideas which existed in Africa 60, 70 years ago. The idea of African unity and the use of natural resources for the benefit of the majority of the African people, workers, peasants, the poor. But this can only be done, as I say, not just as the struggle against one set of imperialist robbers so that another different set of imperialist robbers can benefit, but fundamental transformation of society in which workers and peasants take control. And they take control of the natural resources, the factories, the land, and so on. And the first thing that they need to do is to throw away foreign debt, which is one of the clearest ways in which imperialist domination is exercised in these countries.
Let's talk about our own struggles in Latin America. We've had a year full of worker struggles, and it's important to acknowledge that we are united in our desire to create a world where workers are not only seen as workers, we're also fathers, we're also sisters, we're also mothers, we also people who create culture, people who create beauty, and people who define and design new futures, for ourselves.
I would say that in the last half a year, there have been perhaps three, I will highlight three struggles. The first one is the struggle in Peru against the military coup. The coup was in December. They removed President Castillo, who had been elected democratically 16 months earlier in 2021. And he was removed from power. And the reason he was removed from power is because he had a program of basically using the natural resources of the country, particularly mining, for the benefit of the majority. And the oligarchy couldn't accept that. The multinationals couldn't accept that, and they started sabotaging his government from day one. Unfortunately, he made a number of concessions. He watered down his program. He made concessions to the powerful, the rich, the wealthy, the bosses confederation, and so on. But nevertheless, they wanted to remove him because he is a teacher trade unionist who comes from a poor rural area in Cajamarca. And that in itself is a threat to the power of the capitalist class, the capitalist oligarchy and imperialists in Peru. The idea that someone who comes from the working people can rule the country, that's anathema to them in itself. So finally he was removed at the beginning of December, and that triggered a wave of mass mobilizations, really powerful. The fact that the new government of Dina Boluarte has no legitimacy, used the army, the police. Over 40 people were killed officially by police repression, but the real figure is probably higher. Police and army repression. Here we see the army using assault rifles against the unarmed civilian population that were protesting against the anti-democratic coup. And there was not a peep from the United States. On the contrary, the United States supported this illegitimate coup government of Dina Boluarte. Now, finally, in the middle of February, the protests more or less subsided. Of course, people can't be on the streets all the time, and there wasn't a clear perspective for victory. But now, in the last week, the protests have resumed in what they described as La Segunda Toma de Lima, taking over Lima for the second time. And these demonstrations have been big. It shows that the government and Congress have not reestablished legitimacy. I think that the approval rates for the coup president, Dina Boluarte, is around 10%. Approval ratings for the Congress is about 7%. So the overwhelming majority of people don't want any of this. But they remain in power through repression and through the lack of a clear strategy to overthrow them. But this is not the end of the story. This government illegitimate government has not reclaimed legitimacy. And sooner or later, there will be another wave of mobilizations. The second one I wanted to mention is the mobilizations in Jujuy, in the northwest of Argentina. Mass mobilizations into two provinces, in fact, not just in Jujuy, but also in Salta. Mobilizations of the indigenous people, mobilizations of the peasant communities, mobilizations of the teachers, primary and secondary school teachers. And these mobilizations went on, still going on in the case of Jujuy. Mass movements with road blockades, clashes with the police, most brutal police repression, the arrest of leaders. And behind this, one of the key questions was the question of lithium. Lithium is now a very important mineral because it's used for electric car batteries. And the production of lithium is concentrated in a few parts in the planet. And one of them is this area, Chile, Bolivia, and the north of Argentina. This area is where the largest concentrations of lithium are found anywhere in the world. And in order to extract lithium, they need a lot of water, and they need a disruption of natural resources and so on. And obviously, the local population are protesting against this. And these are very interesting, very significant, very important, very courageous mass movement in the northwest of Argentina, a country that's in the grips of the IMF, through this mechanism that we were talking about, the foreign debt. Foreign debt that was contracted by the government of Macri, that was given for political reasons under pressure from President Trump in the United States, so that Macri will win the election. And now the country is saddled with this massive debt. Unfortunately, the government of Alberto Fernandez has accepted this debt instead of repudiating it, and now it's negotiating the terms for the return of this money at the cost of the interests of the majority of the population. And finally, the third one I wanted to mention is Cuba. Cuba is in an extremely difficult economic situation. So it's like a perfect storm of negative economic factors. The pandemic, which led to a collapse in tourism, which is one of the main sources of income for the country. The crisis in Venezuela, which was supplying with Cuba with cheap oil. The rise in the prices of food that Cuba has to import from the world market. The rise in the prices of energy products, any sources of energy, which Cuba imports from the world market, and so on. Plus the increase, the tightening of the noose of the embargo by the United States under the Trump administration, which the Biden administration has kept intact. And nevertheless, Cuba has resisted for the last 6 months and for the last 2 or 3 years, a very difficult situation. And is one country that deserves our solidarity, not only practical solidarity, but also political solidarity. The spread of revolutionary movements around Latin America, the advance of the revolutionary movement in the capitalist countries is in the long term, in the medium and long term, the only thing that can save the Cuban revolution. Because this is what we must draw as a general conclusion. You cannot have socialism, you cannot have social transformation just in one country. Obviously, you must start somewhere, but socialism must be a worldwide system, because capitalism and imperialism exist as a worldwide system. And as long as it is left somewhere to continue to exist, it will try to destroy any attempts by working people to get organized and to take control of their future into their own hands through any means necessary, through the means of a military intervention, through the means of a military dictatorship, of which we know a lot in Latin America, through the means of an embargo, economic sanctions on third countries, and so on. Sanctions, after all, are also a form of war by economic means. So, yes, I would say these are 3 very important struggles, including the courageous resistance of the working people of Cuba. And the best way to help these struggles is to spread the ideas and the practice of revolution everywhere. So as you said before, this capitalist system in its senile decay stage becomes more violent, more damaging to the environment, and really threatens the existence of life on the planet. So we must put an end to it.
It's so interesting that we are doing a review, but at the same time, I think we are looking at our struggles, and it's, as you point out, Latin America has had over 100 years of fighting U.S. imperialism. But worldwide, we are now at the point where our struggles are interlinking, whether it be through climate change, becoming global warming now, becoming global boiling. We are needing to become united in our efforts. So what keeps you motivated? What keeps you energized?
Today we have the technology and the means of production necessary to produce a world of plenty, and nevertheless, people are still dying of hunger, malnourishment, of curable diseases. So, yes, we draw inspiration from our own history of struggle, from current struggles, and at the end of the day, from the fact that we could build a paradise on Earth if only, and this is the only obstacle, if only we overthrow this rotten capitalist system, the private profit motive that runs behind the economy, that controls the economic decisions. And this is possible. It's not only possible, it's necessary, and today is more necessary than ever, I would say.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's been a pleasure, as always.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.